welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take the often really dense history of the American founding and kind of pull out the key thing, the crucial moments you need to know.
And today, we're not just looking at the usual story of everyone marching in lockstep.
No, exactly. We're diving into the messy reality, the brilliant, yes, but also deeply contradictory world of the Founding Fathers. We want to focus on how their backgrounds, their very different upbringings and early lives really set them on a collision course, even while they were, fighting for the same goal initially.
Right. That collision is, I think, absolutely key to understanding the early American Republic. We're looking at that pivot, that moment when the unified front against Britain just sort of shattered.
And becomes this internal battle, right? These ideological fights that basically created the government structure we still see traces of today.
Absolutely. These figures, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, Geo, they were intellectual powerhouses, no doubt. But they were also ambitious, driven individuals, competitors.
So the cooperation during the Revolution, it was born of necessity.
Pure necessity. Their alliances were always fragile, always shifting. Maybe as fragile as the new nation itself, honestly.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack those relationships, how they worked together when they had to during the war, and then how almost immediately afterwards they fractured into these really bitter feuds that arguably created the very political DNA of America.
Yeah, the two-party system essentially starts right there.
Let's get into it. And maybe the best place to start is just how different they all were from the get-go. There's this common image, I think, of the founders as this monolithic block, all wealthy, elite, probably slave-owning Virginians or something.
Well, yeah, that stereotype exists. But when you look closer, especially at, say, the two most famous Virginians, Washington and Jefferson, their backgrounds were actually quite different. And those differences really matter.
Okay, let's start with Washington. He was wealthy, right?
Yeah.
Planter class.
Yes. Certainly elite by colonial standard. The Washingtons owned over 10,000 acres, huge holding. And yes, like pretty much all wealthy Virginians, that wealth was built entirely on enslaved labor. But it's interesting, relative to the British aristocracy, they were still seen as sort of colonial commoners, not quite the top tier.
And his childhood wasn't exactly stable, was it?
No, not really. His father, Augustine, was involved in various businesses, land speculation, ironworks. So the family moved around a bit. Little Hunting Creek, Ferry Farm, it wasn't settled.
And then his father died suddenly. That must have been a huge blow. Washington was only, 11?
Just 11. And his father, Augustine, was only 49. It was completely unexpected, and it had a massive impact on George's future.
How so?
Well, primarily, it completely wiped out any chance he had of getting a formal classical education in England, like his older half-brothers had. That path was just closed off.
So he had to rely on practical skills instead of, say, Latin and Greek.
Exactly. And the sources also suggest his relationship with his mother, Mary Ball Washington, was, let's just say cool and distant, is how it's often described.
Really? How do we know that?
From their letter, he'd address her very formally, like, honored madam. Doesn't exactly scream warmth.
No. Sounds like he found an escape, though, visiting his half-brother Lawrence.
Yes, at Mount Vernon. That became his refuge, his connection to a more refined world. Lawrence was a significant. He'd served under Admiral Edward Vernon in the...
hence the name Mount Vernon. Lawrence renamed it.
That's right. Lawrence really mentored George, even tried to get him into the Royal Navy.
But his mother vetoed that, I remember reading.
She did. Put her foot down. So... denied a formal education, denied a naval career, Washington turned to surveying.
Which sounds practical, but why was that specific choice so important for his development?
It was incredibly important. First, it was a good way to make money. But more than that, surveying meant engaging directly with the land, mapping it, understanding its features, its value, especially the vast western lands that were.
So it grounded him in geography, in practical realities, maybe not abstract political theory?
Precisely. He learned about land investment, about managing resource. By the time he was just 20, he'd already acquired over 2,000 acres through his surveying work and investment. It made him pragmatic, focused on structure, action, land. A very different mindset than, say, Jefferson.
Okay, so let's pivot to Jefferson. Definitely not a commoner elite. He was more the established aristocracy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Thomas Jefferson was born into serious wealth and social standing. His father, Peter, was a successful planter and surveyor himself, very respected. And his mother, Jane, was a Randolph.
The Randolphs. That was the name in Virginia society, wasn't it?
Pretty much the pinnacle of the Virginia gen. So when his father died, Jefferson inherited the Shadwell plantation, about 2,750 acres, and crucially 66 enslaved. He was only 14.
And unlike Washington, Jefferson got that top-tier classical education.
He absolutely did. Private tutors, rigorous study of Latin, Greek, classical history.
Yep.
It was the standard education for a young man of his class, and he excelled.
Then he went off to the College of William and Mary, and that's where he really dove into the Enlightenment thing.
Yes. William and Mary exposed him directly to the most radical, influential ideas: John Locke, Isaac Adams, the giants of the Enlightenment. And he wasn't a casual student. The sources say he was incredibly disciplined, sometimes studying like up to 15 hours a day.
15 hours just devouring books.
Completely. That intense immersion in classical history and Enlightenment philosophy, you really can't overstate how much it shaped his entire worldview. It cemented his belief in reason, in natural rights, in the ideals of government. It's a very stark contrast to Washington's practical, hands-on, land-based education.
Okay, so two very different Virginians. Let's head north. John Adams in Massachusetts. What does he fit?
Adams comes from a solid, respectable Massachusetts affluent circle. His father was a deacon, a farmer, a cordwainer, but not the planter elite like Washington. More like a upper middle class, maybe. But crucially, he was highly educated at Harvard, a lawyer through and through.
And his personality. He doesn't sound like the easiest guy to get along with.
No, prickly is a word that comes up a lot. Highly intellectual, incredibly rigorous in his legal thinking, but also known for being, well, rebellious, sometimes arrogant, definitely not always accommodating. He could be quite cold.
But he had a strong partner in his wife, Abigail.
Oh, tremendously strong. Abigail Smith Adams. She was actually his third cousin. Their marriage, from everything we can tell, was a real partnership of intellect, based on deep mutual respect. Smart, politically savvy, and often acted as a vital, moderating influence. A sounding board and sometimes a needed break.
Right. Okay, last one for this early look. Benjamin Franklin. He seems like he breaks the mold entirely.
Franklin is just born in Boston, 17. His father was a tallow chandler. Basically a candle and soap maker. Very humble beginning.
And his education was minimal, formally speaking.
Extremely limited. He did about a year at Boston Latin School. Then his father pulled him out because they couldn't afford it. Almost everything he learned, he taught himself. He just loved voration. And he was always experimenting. That famous story about him flying a kite while swimming.
Right. To see if the wind could pull him across the pond. That's pure Franklin applied curiosity. Not just theory, but trying things out.
And then he famously runs away, right, from his apprentice.
Yes. He was indentured to his older brother, James, who was a printer in Boston. Ben didn't like working for him, so he broke his indenture, which was illegal, by the way, and secretly got on a ship. Landed first in New York, found no work, then ended up in Philadelphia in 1723. A teenage runaway, basically.
Incredible. And in Philadelphia, he just dedicates himself to self-improvement.
Completely. Frugal living, constant reading, and famously, his list of 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality. He methodically worked on mastering each one.
Although he admitted later that one virtue gave him more trouble than the others.
Yes. He confessed that order, having a place for everything, keeping everything in its place, and sticking to a schedule was the one he constantly struggled with. I think a lot of us can probably relate to that.
Definitely. And there's that great anecdote, you have to tell it, about him visiting Cotton Mather.
Ah, yes. The famous Puritan minister in Boston. Mather was showing young Franklin out through a sort of low passageway.
Right. And Franklin, not paying attention, is about to smack his head on a low.
And Mather shouts out, "Stoop, young man, stoop." Franklin ducks just in time.
But Mather uses it as a teaching moment, doesn't he?
He does. He says something like, "Let this be a caution to you, not always to hold your head so high. Stoop, young man, stoop as you go through this world, and you'll miss many hard lumps."
Fantastic advice. And Franklin apparently took it to heart. That blend of brilliance with a kind of practical humility, a willingness to do when necessary. It served him incredibly well.
Absolutely. Both in building his printing business and later in diplomacy. He became financially secure enough by his 1748 that he essentially retired.
Retired, quote, meaning he stopped day-to-day printing to focus on his real passion: science, invention, civic improvement. His electricity experiments made him world famous long before the revolution off.
So we have this incredibly diverse group: the pragmatic planter general, the aristocratic scholar, the prickly lawyer, the self-made printer scientist. How did they end up on the same side?
Well, it really took sustained and frankly increasingly heavy-handed British policy to push them all together. Initially, the resistance was mostly about money.
Right, things like the Sugar Act in 1764, the Stamp Act in 1765. Colonists were upset about taxes, about the economic impact. Boycotts were organized.
But the big shift, the moment it became less about economics and more about fundamental rights, was arguably the Declaratory Act of 1766.
Explain that one again. Why was it so alarming?
Because Parliament, after repealing the Stamp Act due to colonial pressure, immediately passed the Declaratory Act. And it basically asserted Parliament's absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So no limits. It wasn't about this tax or that tax anymore. It was about the principle. Could Parliament just do whatever it wanted to them without their consent?
Exactly. That's when you see the shift from financial grievance to ideological resistance. It really lit a fire under people.
And we see that radicalization happening individually. Look at John Adams.
Right. Adams, the lawyer, famously defended the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre in 1770. He believed fiercely in the right to a fair trial, even for unpopular defendants, and he got most of them acquitted. That's the moderate rule of law Adams.
But just 3 years later, 1773, the Boston Tea Party happens.
And Adams is thrilled. He calls it one of the grandest events in history. He sees it not as lawless destruction, but as a necessary act of political defiance against tyranny. He'd made the jump from legal process to revolutionary action.
And Washington, down in Virginia, was he radicalizing too?
He was on a parallel track. Around 1768, 1769, he got deeply involved with George Mason's plan for boycotting British goods. He felt the economic pressure was the right way to respond.
But then came the British reaction to the Tea Party, the Intolerable Act, closing the port of Boston, restricting Massachusetts government.
Washington was apparently furious. He saw it as an attack not just on Massachusetts, but on the rights of all the colonies, an existential threat. By July 1774, he's co-authoring the Fairfax Resolves with Mason.
And what did those say?
They stated flat out that taxation and representation are, in their nature, inseparable, no gray area. They argued that Parliament had no right to tax them, period. So these very different men, the planter, the lawyer, were converging on the same core principle: no arbitrary government.
This shared fear, this shared principle, it brings them together for the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, September 1770.
Right. Washington is there as a Virginia delegate. Adams is there from Massachusetts. John Jay, a prominent, more conservative lawyer from New York. Initially, Jay was pushing for reconciliation for respectful petition George III.
Jefferson wasn't a delegate at this first Congress, though.
No, he wasn't chosen that time. But he made a huge impact, and he'd written a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America.
Yeah. That basically laid out the whole intellectual case for colonial rights.
But exactly. It was powerful stuff. Historical arguments, philosophical arguments. It circulated widely and made Jefferson a kind of intellectual celebrity for the cause, even though he wasn't physically in the room in 74.
So this first Congress, they're still trying petitions, nonviolent resistance, boycott. They're not calling for independence yet.
No, not yet. Still hoping for a resolution within the British system. But London's response was uncompromising. They saw it as defiance, not legitimate protest.
And then April 1775, Lexington and Concord. The attempt by British troops to seize colonial militia supplies, the shots fired.
That was it. The point of no return. Once blood was shed, the path to revolution, to a full-blown war for independence, pretty much set. Collaboration wasn't just an option, it was essential.
Okay, so war breaks out. The colonies need an army, and critically, they need a leader for that army. This first big decision, appointing the commander-in-chief, was actually a really savvy political move, wasn't it? Driven by John Adams.
It absolutely was. June 1775, the Second Continental Congress is meeting. Adams gets up and proposes George Washington.
Why Washington specifically? He had some military experience from the French and Indian War, but he wasn't necessarily the most experienced military man available.
True. But Adams wasn't just thinking militarily. He was thinking politically. Washington was a Virginian, a prominent landholder from the largest, wealthiest colony. Appointing him immediately signaled that this wasn't just a New England squabble. It was a continental effort. It was crucial for binding the southern colonies to the cause.
So it was about unity as much as military skill. Washington himself was apparently quite reserved about it.
Very. He didn't actively seek the command. He famously attended the Congress in his militia uniform, which maybe sent a signal, but he didn't campaign for it. Adams made the case, and Congress agreed.
And Washington accepted. But stepping into that role, the challenges must have seemed insurmountable.
Oh, completely overwhelming. He wasn't taking command of a trained professional army. He had to create one.
Yeah.
He had to forge a sense of being a national army out of these disparate state militias who often distrusted each other almost as much as trusted the British.
And the practical problem applies. Morale.
Chronic shortages of gun, powder, food, clothing, pay. Morale was constant. Think about the winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 7. Freezing, starving, the army nearly disintegrated. Washington's sheer force of will, his ability to hold it together, was incredible.
He couldn't do it alone. Who were his key people on the ground?
He relied heavily on a few key figures. Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island emerged as probably his most bold and trusted.
And then there was Henry Knox.
Yeah.
Right? The bookseller.
Yeah. Colonel Henry Knox, just 25 years old when the war started. He owned a bookstore in Boston, and he basically taught himself artillery science and military engineering by reading the books in his own shop. Washington made him chief of artillery, and he was brilliant. Pulled off incredible logistical feats, like dragging cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston in the middle of winter.
Amazing. And then in 1777, a young, ambitious officer joins Washington's staff, Alexander Hamilton.
Right. Hamilton had distinguished himself as an artillery captain, showed incredible bravery and intelligence. Washington recognized his talent and brought him onto his personal staff, his military family, as an aide-de-camp.
And Hamilton quickly became indispensable.
Absolutely. He had a quick mind, tireless energy, and a real gift for writing. He ended up handling the bulk of Washington's enormous volume of correspondence orders, reports, letters to Congress. He became, in effect, Washington's chief of staff, his pen, and arguably part of his brain trust. He learned everything about command, administration, and the weaknesses of the existing government structure first.
So while Washington and his team are fighting the military war, the politicians back in Philadelphia are moving towards a final break, the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
Yeah, the momentum for independence had been built. In June 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. Adams was on it, Franklin was on it, but Adams insisted that Jefferson should be the primary author.
Why Jefferson?
Adams gave a few reasons. One, Jefferson was a Virginian, and Virginia's support was crucial. Two, Adams admitted Jefferson was simply a better writer. He had a peculiar felicity of expression, as Adams put it. And three, Adams himself was already seen as outspoken and maybe obnoxious by some delegates, whereas Jefferson was quieter, more respected, so Jefferson got...
And the document he produced,
Yeah.
it fundamentally shifted the narrative, didn't it?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Previous appeals had always been addressed to the king, pleading for their rights as British subject. The Declaration was different. It was an indictment, a prosecution against the king, listing his repeated injuries and usurpation justify separation.
And that opening. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It just established this cornerstone of American idealism.
It did. The language is incredibly powerful. Endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the philosophical bedrock.
But even in that moment of high idealism, there was a major compromise, a really painful one.
Yeah, the contradiction was baked in from the start. Jefferson's original draft included a powerful passage condemning King George III for promoting the slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature itself.
But Congress took it out.
They did. Delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies were utterly reliant on slavery, objected strongly. And some northern delegates who profited from the slave trade were also. To maintain the fragile unity needed to actually fight the war, the clause...
Wow, so the statement of universal rights was only achieved by silencing the condemnation of slavery.
Exactly. It's the central paradox, the original sin, you could say, embedded right there in the founding doc. Liberty and slavery locked together from day one. Hashtag 2.2, winning the war on the battlefield and in diplomacy.
Okay, so the war grinds on.
Yeah.
Washington is often seen as a defensive general, cautious, focused on preserving his army. But he did have moments of real audacity, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He knew when to take calculated risks. The most famous example, of course, is late 1770. The army was demoralized, enlistments were about to expire, the cause seemed lost.
And Washington decides to cross the Delaware River on Christmas night in a storm.
Right. A surprise attack on the Hessian mercenaries stationed at Trenton follows shortly after by another daring attack and victory. Those two victories were absolutely. They revived morale, attracted new recruits, and basically saved the revolution when it was on the ropes.
And even earlier, there was that escape from Long Island.
Yes, August 1776. The army had been badly beaten in the Battle of Long Island. They were trapped, backs against the East River, the British fleet waiting. Capture seemed inevitable.
But then fog.
A remarkably thick, timely fog rolled in over. Under its cover, Washington organized an incredible nighttime evacuation, ferried thousands of troops, horses, equipment across the river to Manhattan, right under the noses of the British. It was a logistical masterpiece born of desperation, showed his coolness under pressure, his ingenuity.
But battles alone weren't going to win this. They needed help. Foreign aid was crucial.
Essential.
Yeah.
Especially naval power, which the colonies completely lacked. And the main target for an alliance was, of course, France, Britain's traditional rival.
And this is where Benjamin Franklin steps onto the world stage as America's chief diplomat.
And what a performance he gave. He arrives in Paris in late 1776, already famous as a scientist and writer, but he leaned into this persona, the rustic, wise American philosopher. Simple clothes, the famous fur cap.
He knew how to play the game.
He absolutely captivated the French court, which was the height of European sensation. He became a sensation. But it wasn't just charm. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, making the case for French support.
And the turning point for France was the American victory at Saratoga.
Yes, October 1777. The surrender of an entire British army under General Burgoyne convinced the French that the Americans actually had a chance of winning. That victory gave Franklin the leverage he needed.
So in February 1778, the treaties are signed. Alliance and commerce.
Huge. France formally recognized American independence and promised military and naval support. That French aid, especially the Navy, would prove absolutely decisive later in the war, particularly at York.
Franklin wasn't the only diplomat abroad, though. John Jay went to Spain.
He did in 1779. He was hoping to get Spanish aid, too, maybe even an alliance. But he found the Spanish court much more cautious, much more interested in what they could gain territory, maybe control of the Mississippi River, than in genuinely helping the Americans. It was a frustrating experience for Jay.
And Adams was in Europe, too, also in France for a time.
Yes, Adams was sent over in 1778 as well, but his experience was different from France. Adams was blunt, maybe a bit impatient with diplomatic niceties. He felt ignored, overshadowed by Franklin's celebrity. He thought Franklin was too deferential to the French. There was definitely some friction there.
That friction, that difference in perspective, becomes really important when it's time to negotiate the actual peace treaty, doesn't it?
Critically important. By 1782, peace talks are starting in Paris. The American commissioners are Franklin, Adams, and John Jay, who joins them from Spain.
And they start to suspect their ally, France, isn't entirely on their side.
Exactly. They get wind, largely through Jay's insights from Spain and Adams' suspicions, that the French foreign minister, Vergennes, is maybe playing a double. France and Spain seemed keen to limit American expansion westward, maybe keep the U.S. confined east of the Appalachians, and they also wanted to restrict American access to the valuable Newfoundland fishing grounds.
Why would France do that?
Yeah.
They were allies.
Well, France had its own interests, and Spain certainly had its own interests, especially regarding Florida and the Mississippi. A strong, expansionist United States might not be in their long-term imperial plan. They wanted an independent U.S., yes, but maybe a weaker, more dependent U.S.
So Adams and Jay face a dilemma. The instructions from Congress, based on the 1778 treaty with France, were clear. Negotiate only with the full knowledge and concurrence of the French.
Right. They were explicitly forbidden from making a separate Britain. But Jay and Adams become convinced that following those instructions would mean sacrificing vital Ameritorists' land and fish.
So they decide to break the rules.
They make a bold, controversial decision. They decide to negotiate separately and secretly with the British delegation, bypassing Vergennes. Franklin was initially hesitant, more inclined to trust the French, but eventually went along with Adam Jay.
That's a massive diplomatic gamble, going against their instructions, potentially angering their crucial ally.
Yeah.
Huge gamble, but it paid off spectacular. Dealing directly with the British, they secured incredibly favorable terms in the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783.
What did they get?
Generous boundaries west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, south to Florida. They got recognition of their independence, of course. And critically, they secured extensive fishing rights off the coast of Canada, which was vital for New England's economy. Far better terms than they likely would have gotten if they'd stuck to negotiating alongside France and Spain.
Wow. So they prioritized American interests over the letter of their alliance. Jay had to smooth things over with Vergennes afterwards, I imagine. Yes, there was some definite damage control needed. Jay had to explain why they... But ultimately, the outcome was a triumph for the new United States. It showed a certain ruthlessness, perhaps. A clear-eyed focus on nationalism that would also characterize the next phase, building the nation itself.
Right. So independence is won, the Treaty of Paris is signed, but the glue that held them together, the common enemy, is gone. And the system they'd created to run the war, the Articles of Confederation, well, it just wasn't working.
What were the main problems with the Articles? Why were they failing?
Fundamentally, the government under the Articles was too weak. The Continental Congress had very limited powers. It couldn't levy taxes directly on the people. It could only request funds from the states, which the states often ignored.
So no money, basically.
Pretty much chronic bankruptcy. It couldn't regulate interstate commerce, leading to trade wars between the states, had no real executive branch to enforce laws. Often, Congress couldn't even get enough delegates to show up to have a quorum to do business. The whole thing was grinding to a halt. And James Madison saw this crisis unfolding perhaps more clearly than anyone.
Madison was deeply alarmed. After the war, he retreated to Montpellier and just buried himself. He undertook this intense study of the history of confederacies, ancient Greek leagues, medieval European examples, trying to figure out why they ultimately failed.
He was doing his homework, preparing for what came next.
Massively prepared. So when the call finally came for a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly just to revise the Articles, Madison arrived ready. He came with a plan.
The Virginia Plan, which wasn't just a revision, was it? It was a blueprint for a whole new government.
Exactly. It proposed a strong national government with three branches, a two-house legislature, bicameral, a national executive, and a national judiciary. It was a radical departure. Madison argued passionately that they needed to create a nation, not just a league of states. He stressed that the government's power should derive directly from the people, not from the state legislature.
But getting that plan, or something like it, adopted, required navigating a minefield of competing interests at the convention.
Oh, absolutely. The debates were fierce. Big states versus small states over representation. Northern states versus southern states, particularly over slavery and how enslaved people would be counted for representation in Texas.
Which led to the major compromise, the Great Compromise.
Right. Proposed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. It broke the deadlock between large and small states by creating the two houses of Congress, the Senate, with equal representation for each state, pleasing the small state, and the House of Representatives with representation based on population, pleasing the large.
And then the other big and much darker compromise, the 3/5 compromise.
Yes. The question was, how do you count the enslaved population for purposes of representation in the House and for direct taxation? Southern delegates wanted to count enslaved people fully for representation to boost their power, but not at all for tax. Northern delegates wanted the opposite.
So they landed on this ugly fraction.
They did. The compromise was that 3/5 of the enslaved population would be counted for both representation and taxation. It gave the southern states significantly more power in Congress and the Electoral College than their free population warranted, embedding the protection of slavery deeper into the political structure.
Amidst all this contentious debate, what was Ben Franklin's role? He was the elder statesman there, wasn't he?
He was. 81 years old by then, frail, often had to be carried into the session. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. He played the role of the diplomat, urging compromise.
Using those skills he honed over decades.
Exactly. His final speech at the convention is famous. He admitted he didn't approve of several parts of the Constitution, but he doubted anyone could make it better. He said he would accept it because he expected no better and was not sure that it is not the best.
Yeah.
He urged every delegate to doubt a little of his own infallibility and sign the document for the sake.
A classic Franklin appeal to pragmatism. So the Constitution gets drafted, ratified after fierce debates in the state, and then George Washington becomes the first president in 1789, and his cabinet choices immediately set the stage for the next round of conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Washington wanted to bring in the best minds, create a cabinet of rivals in a way. He appoints Thomas Jefferson back from his diplomatic France as secretary.
The idealistic scholar.
Right. And then, crucially, he appoints Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury.
The ambitious architect of finance, Washington's former aide.
And Hamilton immediately becomes the dominant figure in the administration. Washington trusted him implicitly, relied heavily on his energy, his vision, and frankly, his expertise in finance, which Washington himself lacked. Hamilton essentially acted as Washington's prime.
He had a grand vision, didn't he, for what America should be?
He did. A powerful, commercially vibrant nation with a strong central government respected on the world stage. And he believed the key was establishing sound public credit and a robust finance.
Which immediately put him on a collision course with Jefferson. Why? What was Jefferson's fundamental objection to Hamilton's vision?
Jefferson deeply distrusted centralized power, especially centralized financial power. He associated it with British-style corruption, with monarchy, with cities and manufacturing things he viewed as detrimental to liberty. His ideal was a republic of independent yeoman farmers, decentralized, agrarian, virtuous. He saw Hamilton's plans as a direct threat to that hashtag 3.2 Washington's cabinet and the
Okay, so the first major battleground is Hamilton's financial plan. He submits his report on public credit to Congress in early 1790. This wasn't just balancing the books, was it?
Not at all. It was nation building through finance. The first big proposal was funding the national debt, meaning the government wouldn't try to pay it all off immediately, but would issue new bonds, guaranteeing payment over time with interest, financed by new federal tax tariffs and an excise tax on whiskey.
Establishing the government's credibility, making its debt a safe investment.
Exactly. But the really explosive part was the second assumption. Hamilton proposed that the federal government should assume or take over substantial debt that the individual states had run up.
Pause there. Why was that so controversial? Why did Hamilton want the national government to take on state debt?
This is absolute. It wasn't just about tidying up finances. It was a deeply political. Many of these state debts were owed to wealthy merchants, financiers, speculators that credit. By having the federal government guarantee these debts, Hamilton was deliberately tying the economic self-interest of powerful individuals directly to accessibility.
So if the federal government collapsed, they wouldn't get paid. He was creating a powerful lobby for federal.
Precise. He wanted those bondholders looking to Congress, to the Treasury for their money, not to the states.
Yeah.
It was a way of consolidating loyalty, shifting power from the states to the center.
And this is where James Madison, who had been Hamilton's key collaborator in writing the Federalist Papers and pushing for the Constitution, breaks with him.
Completely break. Madison saw assumption as fundamentally unfair. Why? Because some states, like his own Virginia, had already made significant progress in paying off their war debt. Assumption seemed to reward states that hadn't been as responsible.
And it rewarded speculators, too, right?
Yes. Many ordinary soldiers had been paid in government IOUs during the war, which they later sold out of desperation for pennies on the dollar to wealthy speculators. Under Hamilton's plan, the government would pay the current holders of these certificates the speculators' face value. Madison thought this was unjust, rewarding insiders while the original patriots got little. It struck him as a betrayal of Republican virtue.
So, a deep ideological split opens up. Then comes Hamilton's next big idea, a national bank.
The Bank of the United States, proposed later in 1790. Hamilton argued it was essential. It would serve as a depository for government funds, issue paper currency to provide a stable national money supply, make loans to the government and business, and generally stimulate commerce, modeled partly on the Bank of England.
And Jefferson and Madison immediately opposed this too. On what ground?
Their primary argument was constitutional. They looked at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which lists the specific powers granted to Congress, things like taxing, borrowing money, regulating commerce, declaring war. They argued that nowhere did the Constitution explicitly give Congress the power to create a corporation, let alone a national bank.
This is the strict construction argument. If it doesn't say you can, you can't.
Exactly. Jefferson, in his advice to Washington, argued that the necessary and proper clause, which gives Congress power to make laws needed to execute powers, should be interpreted very narrowly. A bank might be convenient, he argued, but it wasn't strictly necessary. He feared that if Congress could justify a bank based on convenience, it opened the door to unlimited federal power. It would swallow the state.
But Hamilton had a counter-argument, loose construction.
Hamilton argued for a broader reading. He said necessary really meant needful or useful or conducive. If a bank helped the government carry out its legitimate enumerated powers, like collecting taxes and regulating currency, then it was constitutional under the necessary and proper clause. He argued for implied power.
Washington was caught in the middle. Who did he side with?
He listened carefully to both sides, requested written opinions. Ultimately, he was persuaded by Hamilton's arguments about the bank's utility and constitutionality. He signed the bill creating the first Bank of the United States in February 1791. But the philosophical divide between Hamilton and Jefferson Madison was now a chasm.
And all this conflict over assumption over the bank led to a famous political deal, didn't it? The Compromise of 1790.
Yes. The deadlock in Congress was in southern states, led by Madison, were blocking the assumption bill. Meanwhile, there was a separate fight raging over the permanent location of the national capital. Northerners wanted it to stay in Philadelphia or move to New York. Southerners wanted it further.
So Jefferson brokers a deal, famously over dinner.
According to Jefferson's own account years later, yes, he hosted a dinner with Hamilton and Madison. The bargain was struck. Hamilton agreed to use his influence to get Northern votes to locate the permanent capital city on the banks of the Potomac River land donated by Virginia and Maryland, conveniently close to Washington's Mount Vernon and Madison's Montpelier.
And in return?
In return, Madison agreed to soften his opposition to the Assumption Bill, allowing it to pass Congress. He wouldn't vote for it, but he'd find the necessary votes from Southern congressmen who would switch their positions or abstain.
Wow. So the nation's financial system and the location of its capital city were basically traded for each other.
Pretty much a classic political horse trade. It resolved two major crises simultaneously. But for Madison especially, it felt like an ideological. He believed he'd been forced to compromise on principle to secure a geographical pride. It cemented his view of Hamilton as someone building a government based on financial power and political maneuvering, not Republican virtue. The alliance was well and truly over.
So these cabinet clashes, these policy fights, they quickly solidify into actual political parties, right? America's first parties.
Yes, almost immediately. On one side, you have the Federalists, led principally by Hamilton, supported by Washington, John Adams.
And what did the Federalists generally believe in? What was their platform, so to speak?
They favored a strong central government, believing it was necessary for national unity, stability, and economic development. They emphasized order, respect for authority, public credit. Their vision was more commercial, more oriented towards manufacturing and trade, particularly with Great Britain, which was America's main trading partner.
They saw Britain as a model in some, or at least a necessary partner.
They certainly as a necessary economic partner. Hamilton especially admired aspects of the British system, its financial stability, powerful executive. He viewed Jefferson's faith in the common man and decentralized power with deep bordering on contempt. He feared too much democracy could lead to chaos and our destruction of property.
Okay, and opposing the Federalists were the Republicans,
right,
or sometimes called the Democratic Republicans,
right,
led by Jefferson and Madison.
Right. Their core belief was in limiting federal power and protecting states' rights and individual liberty. They were deeply suspicious of centralized authority, viewing it as inherently dangerous, always tending towards monarch tyranny.
Their ideal was more agrarian.
Yes. Jefferson idealized the independent farmer as the bedrock of the republic, self-sufficient, virtuous, uncorrupted by cities or complex finance. They feared Hamilton's plans would create a dependent class of factory workers and enrich a corrupt financial elite at the expense of the common man.
And their foreign policy outlook was different, too.
Completely different. While Federalists leaned towards Britain for pragmatic economic reasons, the Republicans were passionately pro-French. They saw the French Revolution, at least initially, as a continuation of America's own struggle for liberty, a sister republic fighting against monarchy. They viewed Britain as the old enemy, the source of aristocratic corruption.
This fundamental split split. Strong central government versus states' rights, commercial versus agrarian, pro-British versus pro-French. It comes to a head over foreign policy, particularly with Jay's Treaty.
Absolutely. The relationship with Britain remained incredibly tense after the Revolution. The British still occupied forts on American territory in the Northwest. They were interfering with American shipping, and crucially, they were
Remind us what impressment was. It sounds pretty bad.
It was outrageous. British warships would stop American merchant vessels on the high seas, board them, and forcibly sailors, claiming they were deserters from the royal. Some were, perhaps, but many were American citizens kidnapped. It was a profound violation of American sovereignty.
And it was pushing the U.S. towards another war with Britain.
Dangerously close. Washington was desperate to avoid war. The country was still too weak, too fragile. So in 1794, he sends John Jay, who was then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to London as a special envoy to negotiate a treaty and try to resolve.
What did Jay manage to achieve?
Well, the resulting treaty, Jay's Treaty, signed in late 1794 and ratified in 1795, did achieve Washington's primary. It avoided war. It secured a British promise to finally evacuate the Northwest. It also established some commercial agreements.
But what didn't it achieve?
Critically, it failed to get the British to stop impressing American states. It made significant concessions to Britain regarding trade rights, particularly concerning American trade with the French West. Many felt Jay had given away too much and gotten too little in return.
So the Republican reaction was furious.
Absolutely explosive. Jefferson, Madison, and their supporters denounced the treaty as a complete betrayal of American interests and the French alliance. They saw it as the Federalists selling out the country to British commercial interests, basically aligning the U.S. with monarchical Britain against Republic.
There were protests, public outcry.
Huge protests. Jay himself was burned in effigy. Hamilton was stoned by a mob in New York while trying to speak in favor of the treaty. It became the most divisive issue of Washington's press. Even Washington himself had serious reservations about calling it imperfect. But he ultimately decided that peace, even in unfavorable, was better than war. And he signed.
But the political damage was done. Just hardened those partisan lines.
Completely. Jay's Treaty revealed just how deep the ideological chasm had become. Foreign policy was now inseparable from domestic politics. Every issue seemed to pit Federalist against Republican, Hamilton's vision against Jefferson. The stage was set for an even more bitter political conflict after Washington left office.
Washington famously steps down after 2 terms, warning against factionalism in his farewell address. But the first contested presidential election in 1796 immediately descends into exactly that. It's Adams versus Jefferson.
Right. The Federalist candidate, John Adams, Washington's vice president, against the Republican candidate, Thomas Jefferson. And the election was incredibly close. Adams won, but only by 3 electoral, 71.
And because of the way the Constitution was originally written, the runner-up became vice president.
Exactly. Which created this bizarre, unworkable situation. A Federalist president, Adams, saddled with his chief political rival, the Republican leader, Jefferson, as his vice president. Imagine that today. It guaranteed conflict right at the heart of the executive branch.
And Adams' own party wasn't even fully united behind him, was it? Hamilton was causing trouble.
Hamilton never fully trusted or perhaps liked. He saw him as too independent, maybe too vain. Hamilton secretly tried to manipulate the Electoral College voting to get the Federalist vice presidential candidate, Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina, elected president over Adams. Serious, undermining his own party's candidate.
Yes, it backfired, split the Federalist vote in some states, and probably contributed to Adams's narrow margin of victory. It shows just how personal and fractured the politics had become, even within the Federalist Party. Adams starts his presidency already weak.
And his presidency is immediately dominated by a crisis.
The relationship with revolutionary France just imploded. The French were furious about Jay's Treaty, seeing it as an Anglo-American alliance against them. They started seizing American ships, much like the British had done. Adams tried to negotiate, sending envoys to Paris in 1797.
This leads to the infamous XYZ Affair. What happened there?
The American diplomats arrived in Paris, hoping to meet with the French foreign minister, Talleyrand. Instead, they were approached by 3 shadowy French agents, later referred to in published dispatches as X, Y, and Z, who demanded huge bribes for Talleyrand personally and a large loan for France, just as a precondition for even starting negotiations. Plus, they demanded a formal apology from President Adams for critical remarks he'd made about France. Bribes and an apology just to talk. That's outrageous.
Complete. When news of the XYZ affair reached America in 1798, there was an explosion of anti-French fury. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became the popular slogan. It seemed to confirm Federalist warnings about the radicalism and corruption of the French regime.
This leads to the Quasi-War.
Yes, an undeclared naval war between the U.S. and France fought mostly in the Caribbean from 1798-100. Congress authorized the expansion of the Navy, the creation of a larger army. It looked like full-scale war was imminent.
And riding this wave of anti-French sentiment, the Federalist-controlled Congress passes some extremely controversial laws in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Act.
This was the moment Jefferson Jefferson's worst fears about Federalist intentions seemed to come true. The Alien Acts made it harder for immigrants, who often leaned Republican, to become citizens and gave the president power to imprison or deport non-citizens deemed dangerous.
That sounds problematic, but the Sedition Act was even worse,
Far worse from a civil liberties perspective. The Sedition Act essentially made it a federal crime to publish, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, Congress, or the president with the intent to defame them or bring them into disrepute.
So criticizing the government could land you in jail.
Basically, yeah. And the Federalists immediately used it to target Republican newspaper editors and politicians. Dozens were prosecuted, many were fined, or it was a clear attempt to silence political opposition under the guise of national security during the Quasi-War.
This must have been seen as a direct assault on the First Amendment, on freedom of speech and the press. What was the Republican response?
Outrage and organized resistance. Jefferson, though he was the sitting vice president, secretly drafted the Kentucky Resolution. James Madison secretly drafted the Virginia Resolution.
What did these resolutions argue?
They argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional violations of fundamental rights. More radically, they asserted the doctrine of states' rights. They claimed that the states, having created the federal government through the Constitutional Compact, had the right to judge the constitutionality of federal law. The Kentucky resolutions even hinted that states might have the right to nullify, declare void unconstitutional federal laws within their borders.
Wow, that's a direct challenge to federal authority.
Yeah.
Were they basically threatening secession?
It certainly raised the question of who had the final say on interpreting the Constitution, the federal courts, or the individual state. It laid the groundwork for future conflicts over states' rights, particularly leading up to Adams himself had signed the acts, perhaps reluctantly, but he became the face of what Republicans saw as federal overreach and #tag 4.2, Hamilton's fatal intervention, Jefferson's triumph.
All this bitter, the Quasi-War, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution, sets the stage for the election of 1800, sometimes called the Revolution of 1800.
It was incredibly acrimonious. Adams ran for re-election, but the Federalists were divided, and Hamilton actively worked against Adams again, publishing a scathing pamphlet criticizing his president.
Meanwhile, the Republicans nominated Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr of New York for vice president.
Yeah.
And they won, right? Defeated Adams.
They did defeat Adams, but then something unprecedented happened. Under the electoral system at the time, each elector cast 2 votes, without specifying which was for president and which for vice president. Every Republican elector cast 1 vote for Jefferson and 1 for Burr.
Meaning Jefferson and Burr ended up tied.
Exactly. Both received 73 electoral votes. Adams got 6. So even though everyone understood Jefferson was the intended presidential candidate and Burr the VP, the tie threw the election into the House of Representatives as mandated by Washington.
And the House that had to decide was the outgoing one, still controlled by the Federalists.
Right. The lame duck Federalist majority in the House now had the power to choose between their 2 Republican, Thomas Jefferson or Aaron Burr.
What a situation. They must have hated Jefferson. Did they consider just making Burr president?
Many Federalists absolutely loathed Jefferson and everything he stood for. Burr seemed perhaps less ideologically committed, maybe more opportunistic, potentially someone they could work with or manipulate. There was a real movement among some Federalists to elect Burr. The country teetered on the edge of a constitutional crisis for weeks.
But then Alexander Hamilton stepped again, and this time, maybe his most surprising intervention.
It really is astonishing. Hamilton disliked Jefferson intensely, obviously. They were arch rivals. But Hamilton knew Aaron Burr even better from years of cutthroat New York politics, and he despised Burr.
Why? What was his view of Burr?
Hamilton saw Burr as utterly unprincipled, driven solely by personal ambition, lacking any core beliefs or commitment to the Republic. He famously called Burr the most unfit man in the United States for the office of president. He saw Burr as truly dangerous, potential American Catiline or Caesar who might seize power.
So compared to Burr, Jefferson looked preferable.
In Hamilton's view, yes, Jefferson had dangerous ideas, Hamilton thought, but he was ultimately a man of principle, however flawed. He would likely operate within the Constitution. Burr, Hamilton would destroy it for his own gain.
So what did Hamilton do? He wasn't in the House himself.
He launched an intense letter-writing campaign from New York. He urged Federalist congressmen, pleaded with them, cajoled them, argued that electing Burr would be a disaster for the country and for the Federalist Party. He focused particularly on James A. Bayard, the lone representative from Delaware, whose vote
But he persuaded them.
He convinced Bayard and a few others that Jefferson was the lesser of 2. After 35 deadlocked ballots in the House, on the 36th ballot in February 1801, enough Federalists withheld their votes or cast blank ballots, allowing Jefferson to be elected president. Hamilton essentially delivered the presidency to his greatest political enemy to save the Republic from someone far.
An incredible moment. But the animosity between Hamilton and Burr obviously didn't end there.
Not at all. It only festered. Burr served as Jefferson's vice president, but was marginalized. In 1804, Burr ran for governor of New York, hoping to revive his political career. Hamilton once again campaigned vigorously against him, making scathing remarks about Burr's character, calling him despicable.
And Burr had had enough.
Burr felt his honor had been irrevocably impugned. He demanded an explanation, then satisfaction. Hamilton, trapped by the code of honor of the time, felt he couldn't. They met for a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, the same spot where Hamilton's own son had been killed in 3 years earlier in July 1804.
And Hamilton was shot.
Mortally wounded. He died the next day. The architect of America's financial, the brilliant, controversial, indispensable figure, killed by his political rival. A truly tragic end, underscoring just how personal and intense these political battles had become. Hashtag 4.3, enduring legacy.
So Jefferson becomes president. The Revolution of 1800 peacefully transfers power. And almost immediately, Jefferson faces a situation that tests his own principles. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Right. Napoleon offers to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire vast Louisiana territory to the United States. An incredible opportunity to double the size of the country, secure the Mississippi River, and advance Jefferson's vision of an agrarian empire.
But constitutional.
Right.
Was he allowed to do that?
That was the problem. The Constitution says nothing about the federal government having the power to acquire vast new territory. Jefferson, the champion of strict construction, who fought the National Bank because it wasn't explicitly authorized, found himself contemplating a massive expansion of executive power with no clear constitution.
The irony wasn't lost on his opponents, I bet.
Hamilton, before his death, certainly pointed it out. Jefferson basically had to adopt a loose interpretation of the Constitution, arguing the power to make treaties implied the power to acquire territory. He acted swiftly, without waiting for explicit congressional to seize the opportunity. It was a pragmatic decision that achieved a hugely important national goal, but it definitely contradicted his earlier
Which brings us back to the central, enduring paradox of Thomas Jefferson himself.
It's unavoidable. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," the eloquent voice of human liberty and rights, yet he was a lifelong owner of enslaved people. He inherited slaves as a teenager and owned over 600 people throughout his life at Monticello.
And the evidence regarding Sally Hemings.
The historical evidence, combined with DNA testing in the late 1990s, strongly indicates that Jefferson fathered multiple children with Sally Hemings. Hemings was herself enslaved at Monticello, and she was also his late wife's race half.
And he kept these children, his own children, enslaved.
For most of their lives. He did ensure they were informally freed or allowed to run away as they reached adulthood, and he formally freed several Hemings family members in his will, unlike the vast majority of people he enslaved, who were sold after his death to pay his debt. This freedom seems to have been part of a bargain struck with Sally Hemings when they were in Paris years earlier.
It's so hard to reconcile the ideals with the reality. How do historians grapple with that?
It's the fundamental challenge of understanding Jefferson and his era. He clearly recognized slavery was morally wrong. He called it a moral depravity and a hideous blot. He worried about its effect on white society and feared divine retribution.
But he didn't act decisively.
No. He proposed plans for gradual emancipation early in his career, but they went nowhere. Later, he seemed to prioritize maintaining Southern political unity, his own financial stability, which was deeply entangled with enslaved labor, and perhaps feared the social upheaval that emancipation would cause. He essentially kicked the can down the road, leaving the problem for future generations.
How does that compare to someone like Washington or Jay on slavery?
It's a stark contrast. Washington, also a major slave owner, made the decision in his will to free all the people enslaved by him upon Martha's death. It was a powerful statement, even if delayed. John Jay was actively involved in the abolitionist movement, serving as president of the New York Manumission Society. They took action. Jefferson, despite his intellectual opposition, did not. For Jefferson, the architect of liberty, political calculation, and economic reality ultimately seemed to outweigh moral conviction.
But even with all this conflict, all this bitterness, there's a final chapter to the story of Adams and Jefferson, isn't there?
There is. After years of political estrangement following the brutal election of 1800, they eventually reconciled. Around 1812, prompted by their mutual friend Benjamin Rush, they began writing letters to each other.
A correspondence that lasted for years. What did they write about?
Everything. History, philosophy, religion, the future of the Republic, their regret, their shared experiences during the Revolution. It's an extraordinary exchange between two giants looking back on their lives and the nation they helped create. A renewal of friendship after decades.
And then the final, almost unbelievable coincidence.
It's one of history's most poignant moments. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the very same day, July 4th, 1826.
The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, exactly 50 years to the day.
Incredible. Adams's last words, spoken that afternoon in Massachusetts, were famously reported as Thomas Jefferson survived. He didn't know that Jefferson had actually passed away a few hours earlier at Monticello in Virginia. A final shared destiny for these two founders who embodied so much of the nation's early promise and conflict. Hashtag tech outro.
So they've covered a lot of ground, from George Washington trying to forge an army out of nothing, really, to Hamilton building this, controversial but powerful financial system, and through all those deep personal ideological battles that literally created the American political landscape.
Yeah, it's a story of incredible brilliance, incredible ambition, but also, as we've profound moral compromises and contradictions side by side.
Absolutely. And that complexity, especially with the Founding Fathers, it seems so often to stem from that unresolved tension, doesn't it? The tension between those lofty Enlightenment ideals, liberty, equality, and the really harsh economic and social realities of their time, especially slavery.
That's exactly right. And that their clashes weren't just about personality. Hamilton's commercial vision versus Jefferson's agrarian vision, that fundamental disagreement, that friction, it wasn't just noise. It actually created the framework, the two-party dynamic that has shaped American politics ever.
It is pretty amazing when you look back, isn't it?
Yeah.
That some of the key compromises that held the Union together, like the capital moving south in exchange for the Assumption Plan, they weren't based on shared ideals. They were hard-nosed political deals. Geographical trades, really.
Or think about Hamilton making sure Jefferson, his enemy, became president instead of Burr.
Yes.
A purely strategic calculation based on who he thought was less dangerous to the system he...
Which leaves us with a pretty challenging thought, maybe, for you, our listener, to chew on. We've seen intense instability, fierce rivalry, even fatal duels. We've seen deep moral failings alongside genius. Could it be that all that friction, all that intense, messy, contradictory conflict between these founders, was it actually necessary? Was that the chaotic process required to actually test and temper and ultimately forge a constitutional system that could somehow endure?